an actor, and a bunch of listless characters that otherwise would have never been known in the history of this country and would have gone into obscurity, ends up plotting to do something that changes the course of history for many people. Today, we're out on the trail for the pursuit of John Wilkes Booth. April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrenders the Army of Northern Virginia in Appomattox. Right after that happens, people start showing up at the White House and they start serenading the President of the United States at the White House. The President comes out, thanking the crowd for the singing, tells them to strike up the band song Dixie because it's one of the best tunes he ever heard. And then he tells the crowd he's going to give a speech. He promises that crowd he will give a speech. Then he decides to give a speech on April 11th. John Wilkes Booth happens to be in the crowd that night on April 11th when the president gives the speech. During that speech, the president says some remarks that catches John Wilkes Booth's ears and really pisses him off. Now, to set the stage, if you will, for this actor, what is John Wilkes Booth? Well, he's a well-known actor at that time. He played a lot of villainous characters, and his family is more known than he is. Not only that, but acting wasn't really seen as something that was particularly special before his lifetime. But now, all of a sudden, he's extremely famous, he's a handsome man, and everybody wants a piece of his action. So he's very privileged, if you will. Privileged to do the job that he does. And he lives a pretty decent lifestyle, too. But what else is he? He's a Southern sympathizer for their cause. He's also extremely racist. He believes in the institution of slavery. He believes in the white supremacy ideology. So he's the type of extremist that it would take to full-fledged go into doing something like this. And it sets the stage for what we have happen on April 14th, 1865. I'm out here at the square right in front of the White House, and at this location Abraham Lincoln would have been getting prepared and ready to go to Ford's Theater the night that he was assassinated, and then making his way from here over to Ford's Theater. Now, this square itself is a big tourist attraction. There's a lot of different characters and people out here, but it's a pretty neat place to be. Get a chance to come out to Washington D.C. and walk around. It's definitely one of the highlights. Now, what were the words that Lincoln said that angered Booth so much? to make him say that's the last speech he'll ever give. But he tells the crowd that, quote, "It is also unsatisfactory to some that the elected franchise is not given to the colored man. I would myself prefer that it were now conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers." Now, notice the phrasing. He says the very intelligent and those that serve our cause as soldiers. It's not exactly 100% given to all. It's just a generalized term so that he can fit it into whatever it is he needs to fit it into. That's a typical politician for you. But he does have plans to allow them to vote. With that, John Wilkes Booth says out loud, that's the last speech he'll ever give. And he meant it. And so, real quickly, he sets the stage for the countdown to this assassination. Now, as angry as he was, Booth really didn't have a plan yet in place to assassinate the president. A lot of people like to think that that was the case, but it's not. He wasn't ready or prepared to make something like that happen. And it wasn't until the 14th that it all started to come together. So John Wilkes Booth is an actor, and as such his appearance is going to be handsome, but in some descriptions they have him listed as physically beautiful with eyes that are like living gems or living jewels or something like that. So needless to say, he's attractive, he's charismatic, he has this charm about him, he has really good manners. He also has this grandiose idea of who he is. He thinks of himself as this life-changing, world-changing person. But deep-rooted, really deep down inside, he's a person that does not have the courage to pick up a rifle and end up in the army that he believes in. He does not have what it takes to face the enemy because he fights with that the entire time the war is going on. He could have very easily ended up in the army for the South and fought. But instead, he stayed in Washington, D.C. in his comfort zone, and he continued to put on plays as a young man when most men were involved in the war in some way or the other. What he is a coward. He's a coward that picks up a gun, sneaks up behind a man's back, and shoots him in the back of the head because he doesn't have the courage to face him. That's John Wilkes Booth. So I'm now at the Civil War Trail stop, the Mary Surratt House and Tavern. Now Surratt was a pro-Southern person. Her family was pro-Southern institutions and fully for the cause that the South was fighting for. And at this particular house that I'm at right now, this would have been a safe haven for Confederate spies, really anybody working for the Confederate government coming through this area. John Wilkes Booth ends up bumping into Mary's son in 1864, and they hatch a scheme together to kidnap the President of the United States and take him to Richmond, Virginia. They were going to bring him here, and once they had him here, they were going to then take him down to Richmond as their prisoner. Well, that scheme doesn't work out. So her son John is kind of out of the picture at that point when it comes to the assassination attempt. But their guns, their weapons, the things that they had at the time were stashed here, standing by, ready for them to use if they ever needed them. It's the tenant that's here at this house that gives the damaging testimony that ends up sending Mary Surratt to the gallows. She becomes the first woman that the federal government puts to death. Now, she was fully involved out here. There was no doubt about that. Just how involved, though, I'm not really sure. But the day that she comes out to this house, she just happens to leave behind a package personally sent by John Wilkes Booth. It happens to be his binoculars. So while John Wilkes Booth was a very bitter and angry man on the 14th of April, he didn't really have a plan. He didn't have anything set up. At that same time, Robert Todd Lincoln comes into town from Appomattox, and he's telling his father and his family at breakfast all about the stories of the surrender at Appomattox. They're having breakfast together, and for the first time in a long time, their lives are pretty normal. Outside the fact that he's the president of the United States, they're having breakfast, they're talking, they're laughing and joking. Everybody's making note that Abraham Lincoln is seeming extremely happy, like the tension and the weight of the world has been lifted off his shoulders. Well, some fateful things would happen that would cause a situation for Booth to realize that the moment to finally strike is now, immediately. And it happens to be the mail. When John Wilkes Booth goes to get his mail, he gets some information that makes him realize that he has always had the perfect setting for something like that. It was the theater. John knows the theater better than anybody because he's been all over that theater. The tunnel underneath, the back door, the stairway, the stage, even the actors wouldn't suspect him because everybody knew his face there. Everybody knew who he was. So he used that setting as his trap for President Lincoln because he knew Lincoln was coming to Ford's Theater. At 12:30, John Wilkes Booth receives his mail, and he gets word from one of the men that are there that President Lincoln is in fact coming to the theater that night, and possibly with General Ulysses S. Grant. It's the talk of the town. Everybody's finding out about it. So everybody's clamoring to try to get tickets to be there and see that show just to get a glimpse of those two men. Specifically, General Grant. They're more excited to see him. So Booth, wanting to make sure of it, is poking around for information. And he ends up running into the owner and operator, Mr. Ford. Mr. Ford's actually going out to get decorations for the president's box. He's going to get some red, white, and blue silk backing to put up at the president's box to decorate it for him. And he goes down, I believe it was to the Treasury building, to find some stuff, and he gets it. Well, as he goes down there, he runs into John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth talks to him for a minute and then finds out and confirms for a fact the president's going to be there. That actually starts the clock ticking for John Wilkes Booth and his plan. He had no plan up until that point to do anything. He had a thought and he was curious, but once he finds that out, that's when he starts to set the wheels in motion for the assassination of the President of the United States. Vice President Johnson's not really staying at his home. He's staying at the Kirkwood, which is a hotel downtown in Washington, D.C. And John Wilkes Booth knows this. After he bumps into Ford and gets that information, he goes and does something very weird. He leaves a note for him and it says, "Don't wish to disturb you, but are you home?" It's a very strange thing for him to do. That's one of the many strange things he did that day before he killed the president. So John Wilkes Booth was a desperate man who was injured pretty bad during the entire situation leading up to April 15th and the April 16th. In this house behind me here, Dr. Mudd kept his home and practiced being doctor. But a lot of the stories that talk about Dr. Mudd talk about him as if he was an innocent bystander of some sort, and that he had nothing really to do with the conspiracy. Witnesses, however, portray him a little bit differently. When Booth shows up here at the house, he comes in to get his leg set, and Dr. Mudd helps him out, tells him to go stay upstairs. John Wilkes Booth goes upstairs, ends up in a room up there and is resting up. Dr. Mudd makes his way into Bryantown. And as he goes into Bryantown, he's doing his normal things that he normally does there. And witnesses see him going into town, and he's there unaccompanied, and he's picking up some supplies. By the time he gets back here to the house, he finds Booth is getting ready to depart. I mean, he's a man on the run. He can't take the time to sit back and relax. So Booth takes off. But the cavalry shows up over here to his house, right there, and ends up asking him if he knew that the man that he treated was John Wilkes Booth. Mudd tells the authorities, "No, I had no idea. I had no clue. I didn't even know that President Lincoln was assassinated until I went to Bryantown, and even then they didn't tell me who did it." So all would have been well had it not been for what happened the year prior. So the year prior, Mudd actually bumps into John Wilkes Booth, and people saw that and witnessed it. Mudd is the reason why Booth is in connection with some of the conspirators that help him out with his plans. And Mudd is also linked to some of the spy networks that are going on for the South. The witness accounts are enough to send him to prison. So they end up sending him down to the Florida Keys at a fort that's pretty well isolated. I've been there myself, so I know exactly how isolated that place is. At least one of the forts nearby. And while he's down there, however, in 1867, there's a bad yellow fever outbreak. And he does his job as a doctor. He saves lives down there in the Florida Keys. A lot of them, actually. Had it not been for Dr. Mudd, that whole island might have been might have been wasted by the yellow fever. So as a result, President Johnson actually pardons him. Dr. Mudd ends up coming back to this location here, and eventually he would pass away an old man in the house behind me here at this location. But for a moment in time, Dr. Mudd was involved in some pretty nefarious dealings in history, and his help may have cost Abraham Lincoln his life. He's lucky that anybody gave him a chance to be pardoned. Directly behind me here was the Bryantown Tavern, and this was a place a lot of people frequented in Bryantown. Booth never came here during that escape that he tried to make, but the colonel that was in charge of trying to find him actually came here and set up his camp, his headquarters. Dr. Mudd was actually in this tavern being questioned, and the colonel himself didn't know that Booth was actually staying at Dr. Mudd's house about 4 miles up the road from where I'm at right now. Eventually, Mudd would come here, be questioned, and be transferred to jail not too long after he was here. Also, April 27th, General Hancock would come here and headquarter here as well. So currently I'm out at the site called the St. Mary's Church and Cemetery. And the only reason why this place is significant to the Booth pursuit is this happens to be the place that would lead Dr. Mudd to John Wilkes Booth. This is the moment in time that he conveniently forgot to tell the soldiers about who were asking him questions. No, I don't know what John Wilkes Booth looks like. No, I have no idea who the man is. No, I didn't know the president was assassinated until that day when I went into town. Lie after lie after lie. Later, his wife would write, "The first time I ever saw John Wilkes Booth was in November of 1864. My husband went to Bryantown Church and was introduced to Booth by John Thompson, an old friend from Baltimore, who asked my husband if he knew of anyone who had a good riding horse for sale, to which he replied, 'My next neighbor has one.' Booth came to our home that evening to see about buying the horse. The next morning after breakfast, Booth and Dr. Mudd walked across the field to Squire George Gardner's. Booth soon returned, came in, got his overcoat, and rode away. The horse he purchased was sent to him in Bryantown the next evening." That's Dr. Mudd's wife who wrote that. That's not somebody that's out to get him there. This is a person that wrote this after the fact, and after Mudd had already been sentenced for what he did. Booth and Mudd would meet several times afterwards, leading up to April 15th of 1865, when Mudd ends up setting his leg. The Mudds are buried in the church cemetery, and I'm going to go out there and see if I can't find their graves. So let's go back over what's going on at Washington, D.C. on the 14th. Booth gets that news, and he decides he's going to hold a meeting. So he calls up all of his buddies that he's been working with the last year or so, and he tells them to go to the Herndon house so he can have a meeting with them over there. He ends up going over to Mary Surratt's boarding house and has a conference with her. He talks to her for a little bit. Nobody really knows what he said or what he did other than the people that were involved. Mary tells him that she's about to head out of town and go to the tavern. He hands her a package to take with her and bring to that tavern so it can be picked up later. That much we do know. Then Booth goes to the Herndon house and he unhatches that plan, lays it out on the table for the guys that are sitting there. He tells them all who's going to do what, how it's going to be done, and then Atzerodt gets cold feet. Doesn't want anything to do with it. Hates the idea that it's going to be an assassination and not a kidnapping. For him, a kidnapping's not that big of a deal, which it kind of is, especially when you're talking about the president. But instead of a kidnapping, it's an assassination now. There's going to be a whole lot of people killed. And he really doesn't want to participate in that. Booth tells him, however, that he's written a letter and he's sealed it and given it to a really close friend. And in that letter, he has signed their names and sealed their fates to let the whole world know who was supposed to do what and when and where. And you may as well go ahead and do it anyways, because if this goes down and I'm successful and they're successful and you are not, well, they're going to know you were supposed to do it anyhow. So therefore, they're going to hang you too. Atzerodt eventually agrees to do what he told him to do. And the plan is set. And by 8 p.m., everybody is set in motion to do exactly the bidding of John Wilkes Booth. So what exactly is the plan? Well, Atzerodt's supposed to kill the vice president. He's going to head over to the hotel because Booth knows he's there, and he's going to murder him there. And then David Harold and Lewis Powell are supposed to go to Seward's home, and Lewis Powell is going to take care of Secretary of State. Then you have David Harold, who would then meet Booth later on. It all seems like it's going to unfold the right way. It's planned out pretty good. I mean, even Seward's laid up in bed and he can't help himself. So, but the plan starts to fall apart real fast. Starting with what happens at Seward's place. When they get there and they go to attack him, there's a struggle with other people in the house. And he gets up there and he attacks Seward all right, but he doesn't end up killing him. He just maims him pretty bad. Atzerodt goes to where he's supposed to go, is pounding liquor, gets cold feet, walks out of the hotel and leaves. Does absolutely nothing. John Wilkes Booth, on the other hand, John Wilkes Booth is ready to do what he's pumped himself up to do. And he grabs his weapon of choice and a whole bunch of other things to pack with him, packing light for this trip south to Virginia. So that night, Abraham Lincoln's playful. He's joking and laughing with his wife. He's holding her hand. She's making a comment about what will the people say? What will Clara say? Of you holding all over me like this. And they're generally just having a good time. They were actually late to their carriage that was supposed to take them to the theater. And really, they didn't have any protection with them either. The man that had been by Lincoln's side for a long time was the only person that was there guarding the door. So they get to the theater. It's about 8:30, 8:35. They make their way in. And the two people that are there with him is Major Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, I believe is her name. Now, their story is kind of interesting. Now, Major Rathbone had been involved in the Battle of Antietam, and he'd also been involved in the Battle of Fredericksburg. But somehow, he ends up getting a desk job in 1863 that takes him off the field. Now, it's been speculated as to why that happened. And of course, there's documentation to say where he was when he was doing whatever it was he was doing. After the war, however, and after the assassination, of course, they blame the assassination for this, but Major Rathbone ends up losing his mind. He becomes insane. He starts accusing his wife of running around on him. He starts being very suspicious of everybody. Then, while he's overseas, he murders his wife. He turns a knife on himself and stabs himself. Of course, he's admitted to an insane hospital, and they keep him on lockdown. He survives his own wound. But Rathbone was never really the same. And they say it was because of his anguish over being helpless during that night with the struggle with Abraham Lincoln and Booth. Now, one thing's for sure, if Rathbone wasn't there and didn't grab onto Booth's coat, it's possible that Booth makes that clean jump down to the stage and gets out of there as fast as he can, and his leg's never even broken. And then some speculate also that the jump just sprained his leg, that Booth actually received a broken leg somewhere else because of how quickly he was able to get out of the theater and onto his horse. But most say that he broke his leg there in the theater. So about 9 p.m. Booth arrives at Ford's Theater. He's out back of the theater, and he hands his horse to a man out back and tells him to hold on to him. That horse is unruly. It's a rented mare, so that thing is all over the place. And the man that's holding that horse has to walk it back and forth and try to keep it in order. It's not fun at all. Booth's plan is to get into that theater and go across behind the setting and end up somehow inside the box where the president is. But what ends up happening is he has to go under the stage, and he knows the tunnel that goes under there. So now let's set the scene for that. Think about this. Booth is crawling underneath that stage. He can hear the actors above him. He can hear their footsteps. The wooden boards are creaking. He can hear the audience laughing at this comedy that's going on. And it's kind of dark down there. And he's making his way across silently with his heart pounding. Determined. And he's just had a few shots in him too. So he's probably had a good buzz on as he's heading into that theater. Once he finally makes it to the other side, he gets to that stairwell. He makes his way up. And to his surprise, no one is there guarding the President of the United States. It's just the man that's been there the entire time with Lincoln. And he's outside the door. Booth shows him something, but people don't know what it is. The man allows Booth to go inside. Booth sneaks inside, and he's waiting for Hawk, that lone actor on the stage, to be there by himself, saying that famous line that makes everybody bust up in that play. And as he creeps up behind the president, nobody notices him. He's already cocked the hammer on that derringer before he even gets in there, so there's no noise on that. He extends his arm out. That line is said. And with the release of that hammer, that 44 caliber derringer pushes that bullet into President Lincoln's head. Somehow it does not come out the other side. Lincoln's head slumps forward. His body loses all muscle tension. It just slumps down in the chair. His wife screams at the top of her lungs. Major Rathbone gets up and tries to see what's going on, tries to grab at Booth, Booth has a Bowie knife on him and is slashing at everybody that gets near him. Booth stabs him in the arm. Then he gets up on the end of that location where the president is. He yells something, and as he goes to jump, Rathbone grabs his jacket. Booth gets his spur caught in the silk that's below where the president was seated. It twists him around a little bit, and he lands in a funny way on the stage. But as he gets up, he looks at the audience and he yells, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. And then he says the South is avenged. And he runs across the stage and out the back. But he's not alone. He's being pursued the entire way through. Booth gets onto that horse as he's being pursued, spurs the heck out of it. And he's a really good horseman, apparently. He gets down to F Street from the alley. He takes a right-hand turn. And from that point on, Booth is on the move and being pursued. So Harold and Booth are trying to find their way south to Virginia, and they get lost. They're trying to keep themselves out of the limelight, so they don't want to go through Bryantown, and they're trying to stay away from as many people as possible so they're not spotted, because they're going through Maryland. And they're making their way through, and they end up enlisting the help of a man named Oswald Swan. They basically pay a guide to try to get them through the swamp. Swan ends up bringing him over to a place that I'm at right now called Rich Hill. And that's that house directly behind me here. And just how much of this house is actually original to the original house, I'm not sure. The man that lives in this house is Samuel Cox. Samuel Cox allows Booth and Harold to stay in his house for 3 or 4 hours. But later, when the forces come out here and question him and a servant that lives in the house with him, both of them deny that anybody's been here. Now, I'm sure, given the times that they were living in, the other person that was in that house was not about to tell the secrets that Samuel Cox had. So, no nefarious dealings on her part. But Samuel Cox ends up concealing them here at this house for about 3 to 4 hours. And then out in the pine thicket that we're about to go to, location that's over there, he helps to conceal them out there too. He feeds them, he brings them information, he sends things back and forth. Harold does a lot of the running since he's not recognizable like Booth is. And that's Samuel Cox's part in all of this here at the pursuit of John Wilkes Booth. Now, as I'm walking out to the barn out here at Ridge Hill, the Samuel Cox home, you may not be able to tell by listening to the sound, but this place is eerie. It has a silence. You can hear cars coming from miles away. And the only thing that you can hear out here making any kind of sound are the crickets and the birds. So just imagine, it's a little bit after midnight on the 16th, and these two criminals come rolling up to your house, and they've just assassinated the president. The shock that you probably have knowing that these guys are here and the noise coming, no idea that you were about to have guests. course, he's a sympathizer, so he's not really concerned with all of that. But just listen to the sounds. This is pretty creepy. Now, Cox enlists the help of his foster brother, Jones, out here at this thicket of woods. And he sets up Booth in this thicket here. And they send their overseer, Roby, back and forth to help them out. Roby brings them supplies, articles from the newspaper, and essentially anything that they need while they're out here. And eventually, they would be taken south to be heralded to the so-called Confederate underground. While Booth is out here for the couple of days that he's out here, he finds out that the newspapers, both D.C. and in the South, are not a fan of what he's done. He's a villain. And he tries to justify what he did in his pocket diary, writing that Abraham Lincoln was the reason for all of the death and destruction in the South, that he's the reason for the country's problems, and that Booth was simply just the instrument for which Lincoln would be punished. That's the way he saw himself, as an instrument of God to punish Abraham Lincoln. Imagine this. You're a well-kept man. You've made lots of money. You haven't had to sacrifice very much during the Civil War. You live pretty well from boarding room to boarding room, acting, famous, people know who you are. You're feeling very confident about yourself. You're very dapper. And then you get brought out here to this pine thicket behind me here, and you're having to rough it off the land. I don't think he was having a good time. So out here in this unassuming place is roughly where John Wilkes Booth crossed over the Potomac on April 20th. He'd been concealed for several days out in the pine thicket that we just went to not too long ago. He was guided by Thomas A. Jones, a Confederate signal agent, and they traveled about a mile to the mouth of a small stream where Jones had hidden a rowboat before pushing the fugitives off into the darkness. He recommended that they follow the compass heading that would take them across the river to Matthias Point and downstream to Mocadoc Creek, the home of Elizabeth Quisenberry at present-day Dahlgren, Virginia. They didn't reach Virginia that night. Disoriented again, they rode to Nanjemoy Creek, Maryland, near John J. Hughes' home, and they spent the next day resting and reached Quisenberry's on the second try. So for a guy that really wants to get out of Maryland and Washington, D.C., and escape what he's done and try to get to Virginia, him and Harold really aren't, they're not astute at the fugitive thing, getting away from authorities. They bungled it yet again out here on this river in the Potomac. Can you imagine the goofery that's going on right now? I mean, we've got two people who are accomplices in the murder of the president. They can't figure out how to get through a forest by themselves. They can't figure out how to get across a river by themselves. They can't figure out how to navigate a compass by themselves. There's no wonder why Booth didn't want to be a soldier. He would have made a terrible soldier. And here they are crossing this river, trying to take the advice of an actual guide who tells them exactly how to get there, and they still get lost. Seems like Booth might have needed a GPS back in those days. He wasn't very good at much other than acting. I'm headed out to a spot now. It's called Matthias Point. And according to the sign behind me here, Matthias Point was a site of a lot of guns that was up and down the Potomac. They used to harass the United States Navy. It's also the site where the first U.S. Navy officer was killed in combat out here. And the site of a lot of cars. But this is also on the trail for John Wilkes Booth out here. The reason why this is on the trail is because a lot of smuggling used to happen out here, up and down this point. They made their way out to this point across the Potomac River. We are now about to cross into Virginia, and that's when they are trying to seek out refuge or help from Confederate sympathizers. So now I'm at the site of Clydell. And at this house out here, this is where John Wilkes Booth and Harold come up to try to get some assistance on their journey. They had just gotten done at Quisenberry's house, got some food from her, and they asked for assistance to purchase a couple of horses and to get assistance throughout the South, because they think they're going to come over the river and get help from people out here because they have just killed Abraham Lincoln, the so-called tyrant. Well, what they didn't expect is these people out here were not going to have it. You murdered somebody, plain and simple. And they weren't going to be a party to that. They didn't want to get hanged for what John Wilkes Booth and his cohorts had done. So Miss Quisenberry actually gave them some food and sent them on their way. Then they come over here to Clydell and they asked for assistance. And the owner of this property said absolutely not. He wasn't going to help them out at all. So again, the clock's ticking. There's not much time left for them. They're on the run, and they know that the cavalry is out and about looking for them, trying to find them. It's only a matter of time before the authorities catch up to them, and then it'll be the end. So coming up here behind me in just a second is the Peyton Brockenborough house. Now on April 24th of 1865, Booth, several Confederate soldiers, and Harold show up here at this house. And it doesn't look like much now, but at the time it was a beautiful place. Booth was being described as a wounded Confederate soldier so that people would have sympathy for him, allow him in at this point. This is 2:30 p.m. on April 24th of 1865. The missus of the house, Miss Peyton, allowed the men to come inside and sit in the parlor. Then after a while, and seeing their actions and how at home they were, she got a little concerned and she decided it's probably not the best idea. So she tells the gentleman, look, the man of the house isn't here. It probably wouldn't be looked favorably upon me to have you in here while he is gone. So I'll kindly ask you to leave. And then she directed them to the Garrett farm. From here, Booth leaves and ends up at the Garrett farm, where Mr. Garrett does take sympathy for him and houses him at the Garrett farm, and he ends up in that barn. That's when the Federals close in on him just a few days or a couple days later on the 26th, about 10 to 11 days after the assassination of President Lincoln. So out here in the location was the Star Hotel, and private jet was out here inside this hotel. And this place was known as a place for spies for the Confederacy. And so the cavalry comes out here knowing that they're going to find somebody. They end up finding him inside. And apparently he was asleep in a room where the proprietor's son was as well. The son gets mistaken for John Wilkes Booth. They're going to shoot him, but they decide not to. Jed eventually leads him back to John Wilkes Booth at the Garrett barn. He thought that Booth wasn't going to be there, and he even told them as much. But when they get there, they find Booth inside, and that's where we're headed to next. To a roadside marker where the Garrett farm used to be, and we'll see what we can see over there. It's Booth's final moments. The 16th has tracked down somebody that knows exactly where he's at. And they've gotten word that Booth is held up in a tobacco barn on the Garrett farm. I'm out here in the woods right now at approximately the location of where that tobacco barn would have been. And this is where the Garrett farm would have also been, along with the house where he died that last day that he was alive, on the front porch of the Garrett farm. Now, quite like the legacy he thought he was going to leave himself, the property is kind of washed away with history. There's no sign of the barn, nothing out here that really would indicate where it all happened, so you kind of have to use your imagination. There is a roadside marker, however, that tells about the hill and the fact that the barn used to be a short distance out here in these woods from where that marker is. So I hiked around and kind of looked at the area. I'm not seeing a whole lot other than trees and fields. There's not much left behind. And this actor was acting right up to the very end of his life. Once the 16th got out here to the barn and they tracked him down, they yelled at them to surrender. Booth refused to give himself up. Harold eventually gave himself up, and then they set fire to that barn, and Booth was pretty much trapped inside and was going to go down in a blaze of glory. Eventually, Booth gets shot. He's incapacitated, and they go in and they drag him out of that barn. Booth, on the porch, asks someone to hold his hands up so he can see them, because he's pretty much paralyzed. He can't do anything. He looks at his hands and he says the word useless. So you see, he's still playing out his masterpiece right up until the very end, and he's got himself in his own head thinking that he's some sort of hero to the South because of what he did. That he's resolved some great problem. He created a massive problem in the wake of the assassination. A vacuum of power. And really did not help anyone by doing it. He hurt a lot of people. He dies at about sunrise out here on the porch. And that was the end of John Wilkes Booth. And like I said, kind of like his legacy, what he thought he was leaving behind, it got washed away with history. The barn's gone, and this property is nothing but a bunch of trees. So, that was it for John Wilkes Booth. And that's it for this trail, too. Now, there's no Civil War trail stop out here for the Garrett farm because there's nothing to access. There's a Star Hotel, which is the last spot, and that's the spot you saw me in where I was talking about the person that gave up the position of Booth. And that's it. But you got to come trekking back up in this direction from there to this spot in order to get to where Booth actually died. It's been one heck of a ride out here. I've loved every minute of this trail. It's pretty exciting. And there's some cool places along the way too. That Billy's Crab Shack that we ran into on the way. And then there was a cool antique shop that had a huge dinosaur out front. That was fun. But yeah, come on out here, check this place out for yourself, and try to see the history step by step. I'm telling you, civilwartrails.org, that is the place to go to. Go check out their maps. You can actually request a map for free. They'll send it to you. Until next time, this is History of the Waffles.